mini enthusiasts, how are you doing? Welcome back. I hope you're all well and I hope you're having a great day. So you rejoin me here as I start rebuilding the twin SU carburetors. They're 1¼ inch and they're going on the John Cooper conversion racing green project. I've got all the parts ready that I need to rebuild the carburetors, and in the previous episode I'd stripped everything down and ultrasonically cleaned it. So all we've got to do is put it back together, which sounds very simple, but it wasn't. It was quite difficult. I made a few mistakes. I did actually talk through some of this video, but I started getting stressed at one point. Things just weren't going my way, so I've decided to narrate my way through it. So the first job you can see me doing here is I had to re-thread the standoffs for the K&N filters that go on the back of the carburetors. So they're twin K&N, they're like pancake filters, I think they're called. So one of the threads was damaged, so what I actually had to do was weld a new bit of thread on and then retap the thread and get it all cleaned up. So I've just unpacked my SU repair kit there. It comes with new spindle, new jets and all the little bits and bobs, seals, gaskets and washers you need to rebuild the carburetor. And as you can see, I'm using a part box there, so I've got all the old bits laid out in those compartments, and like I mentioned in the previous videos, I made sure that everything is kept to the relevant carburetor. So left hand bits go on left hand carb and right hand bits go on the right hand carb. So the first thing I've done there when it comes to rebuilding it is I've taken the throttle spindles out of the carburetor body there. Now it's really important to check for play in those carburetor spindles, because if you get play in there you can get air leaking through those spindles. In the kit actually comes with a new pair of bushings, which to fit properly you need to remount and then press the bushings in. Luckily for me there was very little, if barely any play in the spindles themselves or in the housings, and I tried the new spindles in there and they seem absolutely fine. What I actually did, I don't know whether I'll capture it in the video here, but I actually lifted it up and blew through the side of the spindle with the spindle in there just to make sure no air was leaking, and it wasn't. You then have the butterfly in the middle of the throttle spindle, and it's quite important to make sure that that seats correctly. I'm pretty sure they can go both way rounds, because on mine I tried it one way round and it didn't seat correctly. I turned it round and it seated perfectly okay. So you need to do that, make sure it doesn't stick, make sure it's centralised. So the next bit, which I'm just doing now, is refitting the jet tube with the locking nut and the adjuster on there. Now that needs centering, which I'll talk about a little bit later in the video, but for the moment I've just refitted the jet tube with new spring and new adjusting nut. Just fitting the float bowl on the body of the carburetor now, and once the float bowl is fitted we then need to fit the jet assembly, which goes into the jet tube underneath the carburetor. And the jet assembly has it's a plastic or nylon pipe which is metal braided to obviously protect it. It's really important to make sure that that is located correctly in the bottom of the float chamber, because it can leak. It's not quite a nut and olive type fixing, but it is similar to that. So it's like a plastic tube with a metal washer and then a rubber O-ring on there, and when you tighten it all up you need to make sure that the plastic pipe is pushed fully home, and then when you tighten it up it obviously holds everything in place, but it is quite easy to get that wrong and it can leak and drip fuel down onto the hot exhaust, which is not good. Now I've moved on to the float assembly itself. So there is a needle valve inside there, and obviously the plastic float which shuts fuel off when the fuel level gets correct inside the float chamber. Now, I don't think there's any adjustment on an HS2. On a HIF carburetor, you can adjust the spring to adjust the float height, but it's just a plastic float on the HS2 carburetor, so they're pretty easy to check. You just need to make sure that when the float lifts to its full height, that it is fully shutting off the fuel flow into the carburetor. I now move my attention to the dashpot, and what we're actually going to do here is just polish up the dashpot while it's off the car. So the dashpot is a little bit corroded, so it's never going to be perfect, and I didn't spend too long doing this. Look away now if you're a machinist, or it's probably not the best way of doing this, so don't do as I do. So I've just got a drill locked in a vise, and I've just put it on a lowish speed, and the first run over I'm doing it with is a medium Scotch-Brite pad, and yeah, it didn't take long to clean up, to be honest. Quick run over with a medium Scotch-Brite pad, and then I run over the Scotch-Brite pad again with Auto Sol metal cleaner on there. And then as a final polish, I just used Auto Sol metal cleaner on just a bit of microfiber cloth and gave it a little polish, and it comes up with a near mirror finish. It's good, but like I say, the actual float, the dashpot itself is quite corroded, so it's only so good. The only thing I will say, which I learnt a lesson here actually, is where I ultrasonically cleaned it, you really need to make sure it's all cleaned out and dried afterwards, because the cleaner in the ultrasonic cleaner is water based and it will corrode the metal parts inside the carburetor. So I actually found the dashpot, I had to clean it out because there's very light surface corrosion on the damper assembly in the dashpot, so just, you know, note for the future. Now this is where it all started going wrong, and I started getting a bit stressed. So I got to this point, I knew I had a broken bolt for the dashpot in the carburetor housing, but I completely forgot to remove it. So I've got to the point where I've pretty much fully rebuilt the carburetor, and now I'm drilling out a broken bolt. I'm getting metal shavings everywhere. I got the broken bolt out, and then I didn't have a tap small enough to retap the hole. So in the end, I ended up making a bit of a thread chaser, which is just like one of the old dashpot bolts, which I kind of sharpen the thread, make it into a thread chaser, and I actually used that to recut a hole in there. Luckily, alloy's much softer than the steel bolt, so it made the thread, and there was a bit of good thread at the bottom. But yeah, I started getting pretty stressed at this point.
Right, sorry about that. I had to turn the camera off. I was stressing. I did manage to eventually get a thread in here. I don't have a tap for it. I don't have anything that small, so I literally just drilled it out to the point I basically made a bit of a thread chaser with an old screw, and I've just about got a thread in there. It's not fantastic, but it will hold it. And then while I was doing it, I snapped off this linkage here, this little end here, so I quickly had to just tack weld that back on again. But yeah, I was getting a bit stressed for a minute. It was just all going wrong. And of course, the last thing you want, I'm trying to be ever so clean and tidy and clinical. We're assembling a carburetor, and then I'm cutting and grinding, which is really don't want to be doing that. Right, one thing I did work out, which I've got to do, is centre this part. It actually has a bit of movement in it, and it looks like you centre it by slacking off that nut. So to centre it, I think you have to assemble everything together, all the jet and everything, and then tighten it up at the bottom. Actually, when I got the carb and saw that broken bolt for the float chamber, I thought it's going to be easy to sort that out. I thought it would just come out of a pair of pliers, but it didn't. Now this spring, compared to the old one, is a lot longer. It's still a red spring, which is meant to be standard, or maybe that's been upgraded. Now what I will do, when we've got both sides back together, I'll take the dash pots off again and make sure they both fall at the same rate. Because if one is falling slower or faster than the other, it ain't good. You want them balanced. Right, so to centre this, I think we need to slacken off that. Yeah, it allows it all to move around then. So that looks central, and then I think then you just put the dash pot on. We'll put one of the screws in just to stop it rising back up. That's the long one. So where I had to kind of re-thread that other hole, I've got a longer screw for it as well, just because there was some good thread at the bottom. Right, let's get that right at the bottom. Now we can tighten up this nut here. And I think, in theory, that should all be centred then. We'll have a look in a minute. Yeah, that looks nice and centred now. Cool. I think I'm going to have to tinker with this carb a little bit more. I'm going to come back to it. I'm going to get the other one done because this carb is just stressing me out. It's not good for my mental health.
So yeah, as I mentioned there, it actually took me a few goes with both carburetors to get the jet tubes centered perfectly. It's quite a tricky job. So in theory, you just loosen off the lock nut for the jet tube at the bottom, fit the dash pot with the damper in there and the needle, and then in theory that should centre it all, and then you tighten up the lock nut at the bottom. But what happens is it all seems free, and then when you tighten up the lock nut, it just moves the jet tube ever so slightly, and you just get a tiny little bit of interference. On a worn carburetor, it's probably not so much of an issue because there's a little bit of tolerance there, but when all the bits are new, it is really difficult to get it centered perfectly. And the net result, if you haven't got it centered, the dash pot damper doesn't come down all the way, or it will stick at the right at the very bottom of the carburetor. And this HS2 carb, I think it's an earlier one, so it doesn't have a bias needle on it, or the needle's not on a spring, so there's no movement in it at all. It's a fixed needle. So as it comes down the bottom into the jet tube, it needs to be perfectly central. And like I say, it did take me quite a few goes to get it perfect, probably 3 or 4 goes on each carburetor. The other point to notice, or I noticed as well, there is a bit of movement in the dash pot itself, in the bolt holes at the top. So you could in theory have the jet tube and the needle perfectly centered, and if you take the dash pot out and put it back on and it's slightly in a different position to what it was before, which it can be because there's some tolerance and movements in the hole spacing, you could find that the jet tube is out of alignment again, and you're starting to get the dash pot damper bind very slightly at the bottom. So if you've ever had the dash pot off, it's worth just having a look down the back of the carburetor, pull up the damper, let it drop, and make sure it's dropping all the way by itself, unassisted. Now I do apologise, I've been waffling on a little bit. I have just very quickly just fast forwarded at sort of 16 times building up the second carburettor. I'm not going to talk through that because it's exactly the same as the first one. So now both carburettors are fully built. I'm just getting them mocked up and fitted onto the manifold. I didn't actually realise I've never fitted twin issues before. I just assumed you could build the whole manifold up with the carbs off the car and refit it all in one piece, but you can't. So all of my work refitting it here, you've got to take it all apart again to get it fitted on the car. You might be able to do it, I guess, if you had the engine off the car, but I couldn't find out how to get the manifold nuts on with the carburettors in the way. So I did actually invest in some new heat shields from Mini Spares. I have the original heat shields with it, which were just steel, mild steel, but they were all cracked, and those nice shiny stainless ones there were about 24 quid, I think. I've also, if you look closely, I'm not quite sure which position the heat shields were meant to go, whether it was before or after there's a small spacer between the manifold and the carburettors. When I actually fitted them on the car, I fitted the heat shield first and then the spacer afterwards, if that makes sense. One other thing I did notice as well, there's tolerance and movements in the bolt holes for the carburettors themselves. You've got the linkage bars in between the carburettors, and just that little bit of movement between the two carburettors, what I found was when I was tightening up, it was just causing the link bars to bind very slightly. Not enough to stop anything working, but just the mechanism of the throttle just felt a little bit stiffer than it should do. So again, I had to slacken off the nuts for the carburettor, wiggle it about a bit, get it into sort of the perfect position before tightening it up. Now on some issues I've seen they've got 3 springs on the throttle return. I did fit 3 on here. In fact, I fitted 2 on the throttle and 1 on the choke. I then found I didn't need the one on the choke, so I fitted 3 on the throttle. When I actually got in it and tried the pedal pressure on the car, it was way too much. The pedal was way too stiff, and it made the car quite jerky to drive. So I've actually gone back to 2 springs on the throttle return, which seemed absolutely fine. Now, one thing that's really important when you're refitting these carburettors, I've mentioned previously about, I might not have mentioned actually, so when it comes to fitting the mixture adjusting nut, make sure that they are perfectly synchronized with each other, the same amount of adjustment on both sides. The same goes for the fast idle screw, for the choke, for the throttle screw, and it's really important to make sure that when you're pulling the throttle open from the cable position, that both carburettors are reacting at the same time, because you can get a little bit of play in the mechanism itself, and it can lead to one carburettor lagging slightly behind in the throttle. So it's important just to tinker around and really get it dialed in before you put it on the car.
Blood, sweat and tears. But they look awesome. Well, there we go, all done. I'm quite pleased with that. It was a pain, to be honest, but I think it was worth doing. So I kept quoting the wrong price actually. So a new set of twin carbs on a manifold from Minisport is £1,177. I think I've been saying £1,700. I was mistaken there. So £1,177 for brand new. These, I bought the carbs for £160 second hand, and then I have bought a rebuild kit. I have bought a pair of new needles, pair of springs, the bolts which hold the air filters on, And I think that is it. Just have a look. Needles, springs, rebuild kit, and a few bolts. Oh, and the heat shield as well. So I could have repaired the old one, but I just thought that's going to look so much nicer with a stainless heat shield on there. So that all the bits to refurb it come to £153. So I spent 313 in total buying the carbs and overhauling them, which is quite a saving over a brand new set. Let's just hope they're all right now. They should be okay. All been ultrasonically cleaned, as you've seen, and everything like that. All been set up now. I've just got to get them on the car. Fingers crossed everything should be fine. And I can't wait to hear it running. Can't wait to take it for a drive. I should also mention as well, so I think time-wise to do that, to strip those carbs down, to clean everything up, a few runs through with the ultrasonic cleaner, putting them all back together, sorting out bits like just threaded holes, broken bolts, that sort of thing. I think I spent about 8 hours doing it, so cost me 313 quid, but quite a long time to do it as well. Let's get these back on the car, can't wait.